Good afternoon, and thank you for having me here today. It's a pleasure to be with you and to talk about such an important topic, and that is the challenges and the opportunities around leading through change. I often start my presentation with our mission, which you were able to see through the video that we just presented just now. And our mission really is at the core of everything we're trying to do. And it's quite simply about making decisions easier for our customers and making their lives better. And I think a mission or a purpose or a why is critical, quite frankly, for any organization, but it's especially critical for organizations that are undergoing transformational change. And as was mentioned earlier, we are on a bold, ambitious path of becoming the most digital, customer-centric company in our industry. And therefore, having a mission that aligns and binds every single one of the 35,000 people that work for us is absolutely critical if we're going to go anywhere near towards achieving the goal that we've set for ourselves. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about that, talking about the challenges associated with change and how we're trying to overcome them. And I'm looking forward to a conversation later through a Q&A with Dominic and perhaps the audience. But let me just start with perhaps giving you all a bit of an introduction into who Manulife is. I know that many of you will be familiar with and aware of who Manulife is as an organization, but you may not be aware of how broad our organization is. So Manulife is a 130-year-old Canadian company, a very global organization. In fact, our first president and CEO was the founding father of Canada, Sir John A. Macdonald. And absolutely. And he, in fact, actually had the role of CEO while he was Prime Minister. And now that brings a whole lot of conflict of interest issues to hand, but those were not problems back then in a better time. I'm sure Sir John A. is probably turning in his grave thinking, what is an Australian doing running my company? But it is an honour and a privilege to be running such a storied organisation with such an incredible history. And it's a history that has brought us to many different geographies outside of Canada, which makes us actually somewhat unique. We operate across 3 broad geographies. Obviously here in Canada, we also operate in the US as well as in Asia. In fact, we've been in Asia for 120 years. In fact, only 10 years after we were incorporated here in Canada did we go to Asia, which was an incredibly bold and significant step back then. We have about 35,000 employees, as I mentioned earlier, about 28 million customers, about 80,000 agents, predominantly in Asia, that support the sale of our product and business. We're a top 12 insurance company globally, a top 40 asset management company on the wealth side. And we have about $1 trillion of assets under management. In fact, a little bit over $1.1 trillion of assets under management, which is effectively the money that supports our policies and our liabilities on the insurance side, but also third-party money that we manage on behalf of individuals and institutions. So again, it's an incredible organization with a phenomenal history and one that has really resulted in phenomenal and transformational success. But we're also acutely aware of the fact that what got us here isn't going to be sufficient to getting us where we need to go. And therefore, under the ambition of transformational change, we're going to have to do things radically differently. And that's why the challenges associated with transformation is so front and center for us as we really agitate to become the company that's going to be very successful in the future and not relying on the historic success that we've had in the past. So when I think about transformation and change, I think it's important just to look back at what we've experienced and what we've seen over the last decade. And I would actually start by saying that the amount of change that we've seen over the last 10 years is more significant than we saw in the previous 100 years. Just as a simple fact to bring this point to bear, in the last 4 years, we've collected globally more data than we had in the previous period to the beginning of humankind. So that, and let me just sort of reinforce that point. more data has been collected in the last 4 years than the previous period to the beginning of humankind. That's an incredible statement to how much transformation change we're seeing and how important data is in that transformation journey. And people often reflect back at the last 10 years and they'll describe it as the digital revolution. I actually see it a little bit differently, and I see what we've experienced globally over the last 10 years more as an information revolution that's been brought forward or that's been facilitated by digital technology. So it's really been an information revolution, and what we've seen so dramatically change over the last 10 years is that consumers are much more equipped with information than they ever have in the past. And this is really, really very profound and very significant, and really, I think, becomes the foundation for why transformation is important and why organizations need to change the way they do business. And the reason why it's important is because of the simple fact that information equals knowledge and knowledge equals power. And over the last 10 years, we've seen an incredible power shift between corporations and positions and people in positions of authority to the democratization of information, and where individuals and consumers are now in much greater possession of information and therefore power than ever before. So what we've actually seen over the last decade is an incredible shift of the power equation. And that affects, quite frankly, the way consumers want to work with individuals and how they want to work with corporations and organizations. If I ask you to think back to perhaps 10 years ago, what each of us would do if we got sick is that we would go to a doctor, and the doctor would simply ask us how we're feeling. They might probe and prod us a little bit, and then they would actually tell us exactly what was wrong, and they would prescribe the solution to us. But things have changed. And today, 8 out of 10 people will actually go on WebMD before they even visit the doctor. They will have self-diagnosed their problem, and then they actually visit the doctor to get validation of what they actually already believe to be true. I mean, can I get a show of hands? How many people have actually gone on WebMD before they visited a doctor? Quite a lot of you. And that's kind of scary if you're a doctor. If you're a doctor 10 years ago, you're all powerful and you would sort of command and dictate what was going on. Now you're almost providing, your synopsis of what's happened and looking for whether it sort of resonates with the individual that you're diagnosing. And that we've seen that not just in the field of medicine, but we've seen that in every field of industry. And organizations have gone from being these barons of power and information to now having to facilitate a knowledgeable consumer who now is no longer ignorant to what's available to them and to what is the situation that they're actually currently sitting in. And that is a profound change. And as a result, organizations need to really lift their game, because the consumer, as a result of that, is incredibly more demanding. And in that new world, the consumer is demanding instant, they're demanding intuitive, and they're also demanding simplicity and speed. And organizations that do not provide that are really, quite frankly, doomed to fail. Any organization that has as its core business model the arbitrage of information, i.e., I'm powerful, I can make a profit because I have information that you do not have. If that is the basis of your business model, then it's actually doomed to fail. And that's because of the democratization of information and knowledge, which is going on at this very point in time. So now let me dial forward and look at our industry, insurance. And I'm going to actually ask you to dial back or think back to 1989, 30 years ago. And in 1989, this is what a typical insurance application looked like. It's 38 pages long, and it has 130 questions. Now, would you like to see what an application from 2019 looks like? I see a little bit of nodding. It's exactly the same application. It has not changed. And that's the sad truth. The sad truth is that our industry has not kept pace with the information revolution, has not kept pace with the changing demands of the consumer, and as a result, continues to do business largely the way it has 10, 20, 30 years ago. And that is not going to be a successful recipe for the future. And as a result, there needs to be significant change and disruption to our industry that we need to facilitate and get at the front of. Can I get a show of hands? How many people here are familiar with NPS, Net Promoter Score? So a very significant percentage, at least 70%, which is tremendous. Net Promoter Score is now deemed the most appropriate way to assess how satisfied customers are with you. And quite frankly, it's simply looking at the percentage of promoters, people that are promoting your business and company, versus or minus the detractors. And there are some incredible organizations that have really gone out of their way to delight customers, and as a result have received tremendous Net Promoter Scores. You can see Airbnb, Netflix, Apple up at 89%. So in other words, they have 89% more promoters than they have detractors, which is phenomenal. Now, our industry, as a result of the complexity and the difficulty of operating, has a Net Promoter Score globally of -6. So there are 6% more detractors than there are promoters. Now, many would look at that and would be quite worried. I look at that and see that as a tremendous opportunity. I get incredibly excited about the fact that that really allows for a company that can get on the front foot of driving a customer-centric agenda to really achieve standout success by demonstrating how they can do things radically differently to the way the industry is currently operating. So that sounds kind of simple. You sort of see that and you think, well, that's a pretty compelling reason and argument for change. But the reality is, it's not that simple. Change is really very difficult. And I believe that to understand why change is difficult, you really need to get down to its root causes. And for me, there are 3 root causes that are facilitating the difficulty associated with driving change in large organizations like ours and many others. The first is that organizations like ours have very old legacy systems. This is the wiring behind the wall that supports the delivery of product and services to customers. These systems are typically 50 plus years old and are not designed to work in an agile, customer-friendly and easy way. So the very first port of call is that you need to acknowledge that these legacy systems are in place, and you need to embark upon a journey of overhauling those systems. In some cases, that is replacing them, and in other cases, it's about minimizing the impact of these legacy systems by putting microservice layers above them and then creating agile apps that can interface with the customer and therefore not rely on the legacy system to enable the delivery of services to the consumer. The second big barrier to change is that of this fallacy of somehow thinking that you are unique and you are beyond being disrupted. And again, that goes a little something like this. When I talk to different CEOs in our industry or other industries, that goes a little like this. Well, we are not going to be disrupted because we're too important. Or we're too complex. The regulator won't let us get disrupted because we're such an important part of industry and society. But what I would leave you with is that there are a lot of institutions, a lot of great companies that have fallen by the wayside because they held this belief and they held it to the end, and ultimately it led to their destruction. Companies like Blockbuster, companies like Kodak. Kodak, until the very end, still believed that consumers would not want digital photos and they would always want a hard copy photo. We saw how that went. Blockbuster, again, when dealing with the revolution of Netflix, were in denial. They said, well, no, consumers want to go to a store because the whole experience of picking a movie was a big part of the satisfaction that consumers got when actually consuming a movie in the end. And again, we know how that story goes. The final barrier to change is that, and this is perhaps the most complex, is that of culture. Culture is incredibly difficult to overcome or to change. And the inertia of doing things the way they've always been done often is the most difficult aspect of driving a transformation agenda. And I've got listed there 4 key barriers that prevent change from being embraced by organizations. And each of them are difficult, but they start from the easiest and they end up at the most difficult at the end. The first barrier to change is whether people in your organization actually believe that change is necessary. And I say this is the easiest because most people mentally get that they need to change and they need to evolve to what they're seeing and what they're believing the future will look like. And in our organization, 8 out of 10 people believe that we need to change, which isn't bad. The second barrier, though, is the personalization of that change. And when we ask those same people, so who needs to change? It's never ever them. 5 out of 10 people believe that it's someone else that needs to change, and it's in fact not them. It is the finance department, compliance, risk management, etc., etc. So internalizing the idea that change needs to happen at each individual level is an important barrier that needs to be overcome if you're going to drive and embark on the change agenda. The third obstacle to change is that of urgency. And when do you change? So most people, once they finally get that change needs to happen and they need to change, will put change off. They'll say something like this, well, yeah, that digital revolution, that ain't happening for another 5 or 10 years. We've been doing this the way we have for the last 5, 10 years. It's not going to change overnight. So we can continue to do things the way we are currently doing them. There's no need to do things differently tomorrow. And obviously, that, again, is a recipe for failure. So instilling a sense of urgency around the change agenda is also really very critical if you're going to embark on a change journey. And then finally, when you convince people that they need to change today, it's really, really tough. So to get people to do things differently is hard, but when you start driving that change, it's difficult because it's not what they're used to. And therefore there's resistance to keep doing it because it's uncomfortable. It's a little bit akin to if you've played right-handed tennis your whole life, and then someone asks you to play left-handed tennis, that first game of left-handed tennis is not very comfortable. It's very awkward, it's not very pretty, and you're going to play a terrible game. So the natural bias is to put the racket back in the right hand because that's what you're used to, that's what you're comfortable with. And therefore, to encourage an organization and therefore people in the organization along the change agenda, you need to provide support and acknowledge that there's going to be difficulty, there's going to be issue, and they're going to really struggle to actually continue doing it because they're going to face a lot of awkwardness as they go through it. So when you think about a transformation agenda, most people actually focus a lot of their time and effort on what's most obvious. That is, have we got the strategy in place? Have we got the programs, the projects, the initiatives? And they're all important. But that is just the tip of the iceberg. What is absolutely critical in a change agenda when you're trying to transform an organization is that you spend more time on the culture of change and embodying why change is important and supporting change at each level, each and every level in an organization. And that's really what's under the surface and perhaps more critical. And if you really are embarking on an agenda of change and driving culture, there are 3 things that I'd leave with you that are critical to really ensuring that you can change a culture and you can do it in a systemic way. The first is you need to have a strong purpose, your why, your North Star, the reason you exist, and it has to be compelling and it has to be something that every single one of your employees feels passionate about. And this is the difference between, most organizations will have a purpose, will have a mission, but the difference between successful organizations that embark on a change and culture journey versus those that are not are those that don't simply put this on a poster and put it up on a wall, but rather ensure that their mission, their purpose is something that is lived and breathed each and every day and embodies the way meetings are conducted and the way decisions are actually made. The second element of driving the people agenda for cultural change is that of capability. And it's acknowledging that the capabilities that got you to where you are today are critical, are important, but they're not necessarily going to be the same capabilities that get you to where you want to go. So that acknowledgement is the starting point, but it also means that you need to, A, bring new talent into the organization, talent that has these capabilities, skills, but you also have to bring the people in your organization along with you on the journey. And that means developing them and helping them embrace the new skills and capabilities that are going to be required for success in the future. And that is a fine act of balance that's critical, because what got you here is something that you need to celebrate, but you also have to acknowledge that there are new skills and capabilities, and you can't just simply inject it from outside. You need to foster and build a culture that develops those within the company to have those skills and those capabilities that will allow the company to succeed, but also those individuals to succeed. And then last but not least, passion. Any journey of transformation requires tenacity, requires you to be able to overcome obstacles. There will be a lot of obstacles, difficulties, challenges, and issues as you embark on a change agenda. Again, founded in this idea that you're asking people to do things differently to the way they've done them in the past. And you can't really ask for people to be tenacious unless they feel passionate about the cause. So passion is, in my mind, the final and perhaps most important ingredient, and the one that really does ultimately create the defining or leading edge between companies that embark on change agendas and get mediocre results versus those that really are standouts and deliver phenomenal success in the transformation journey. So that ends my prepared remarks. I'm looking forward to a conversation with Dominic, and I'll leave you again with our mission, which is our noble purpose and why, and that is around making decisions easier and lives better. So thank you.
Great presentation, Roy. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a tradition at the International Economic Forum of the Americas to have good news and great news. Today is not an exception, and truly, my friend, it's my great pleasure, my privilege, and my honor to announce that Dominic Barton will be officially announced this afternoon as the new Canadian ambassador to China. So Dominic, congratulations. We've been working with Dominic for the last couple of years, and I can assure you, Dominic, we wouldn't have thought of somebody better than you to take the job. And we wish you all the best in this journey that should be quite interesting. Thank you so much, Dominic.
Thank you. In good Chinese tradition, a bow of thanks. But I very much want to focus on Roy, and I decided I think I'm going to call you the Steve Jobs of insurance. I've never seen sort of the dynamism. I think in our presentations before, Nick, it's always been behind a podium, but we can feel your passion for the industry and where you are. And it's, if you don't mind me saying, it's normally seen as not the most exciting industry, a boring industry. But I'm sorry, but what you are doing and how you are transforming it and seeing the passion of the employees, the children, and the transformation that you're driving is very inspiring. So
thank you, it's very kind, and congratulations, Dominic. I think it's phenomenal for Canada to have you in such an important role at such a critical time.
Thank you. So I wanted to sort of focus on three areas, because you talked a lot about change. You talk about many of the origins of the business in Asia back in 1897.
Yeah.
And then the notion of purpose, which seemed to be going through all of those areas. So those are the three dimensions I'd like to explore. But I might start with Asia first. You, before you were at Manulife, ran Citigroup's retail banking business for close to a decade. And so I think I have a very good sense of the market. So just where are the big opportunities? And where do you think we are in Canada in terms of capturing those? You're Australian by background. How do we compare? Where do you think the opportunities are?
Yeah. Well, I'm very excited about the opportunity that's Asia, and there are some very significant mega trends that are facilitating why Asia is such a big opportunity. But they're not just, these are mega trends that are not just limited to Asia. They have broader application and implications. The first is that of the growth of the middle class in Asia. There are currently 1.4 billion people in the middle class in Asia today, and that's forecast to grow to 2.8 billion people by 2025. Now that's not a long time away. And in 2025, Asia will represent 2/3 of the world's middle class. And as you see a middle class growing at such a rapid pace, that comes with huge demand for product and services. from companies like ours, but quite frankly, many other organizations and product and service providers. So that's certainly one big driver of growth and opportunity. The other is that of an aging population. The world is aging. There are currently 900 million people aged above 60 today, and again, by 2050, there's going to be 2 billion people. That translates into huge demands for, and people are living longer, by the way, so that translates into huge demands for products like retirement and wealth management. So Asia does represent a significant opportunity. There are some big demographics that are really facilitating and fueling that growth, but those same demographics also translate into an opportunity for geographies like Canada. Today, the protection gap in Canada is about $1 trillion. This is the difference between what people need from a coverage of insurance perspective versus what they currently have. And on the retirement front, the current gap between what people have saved and plan to save for retirement versus what they need to save is about 2.5 trillion. So I think there are some big opportunities that are true for Asia, but also true for us here in Canada. I will also say, though, that most people get excited about the opportunity that's Asian, and they think that they can put their shingle up overnight and just do business and capture all of that. It's not that easy. Asia, as you would know, requires you, and countries in Asia require you to have been there and have basically seen the test of time, been there through difficulties, the challenges, to have earned the credibility and the respect of consumers, but also regulators, so that you get the right to access that market. And that's often something that's perhaps not appreciated as well as it should.
Yeah, so there's long-term relationships and a step. And that, just looking at the map you showed up, there's a lot of green you had there across that. But so ASEAN, China, what the whole region?
Yeah, well, big markets for us are China, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia as well. So,
and how do you think, you spent a lot of time in Australia earlier, like how, Australia obviously doesn't have a US market that's right next door, so by definition probably, but what's your sense of where we are on that front and what we could be doing from a Canadian point of view in the region?
In Asia?
In the whole Asia region.
Well, I think Canada has a huge opportunity in Asia. I think one of the things that really struck me when I joined Manulife, a Canadian company, was how well regarded and respected Canada was, and how the Canadian brand meant so much to Asian consumers, and quite frankly, even in the regulatory sphere. So I think Canada has an incredibly strong and positive starting point. The Canadian brand stands for honesty, stands for integrity, stands for doing the right thing. And I think that is an incredible foundation, quite frankly, that maybe people don't appreciate as much as they should. That gives you great access and entry. And obviously off the back of that, there is a tremendous opportunity to capture the growth drivers that I referenced earlier.
Yeah. But again, you're saying there's lots in Asia, but also given the challenges in there's also big growth opportunities there too, you're saying.
For sure.
I just want to shift a bit to the technology shift and the change. And what you mentioned, the data facts you mentioned, the last 2 years more than our last sort of our whole history in collecting data, and probably in insurance, you're one of the biggest collectors of information of any organizations that are out there. I wanted to get a sense of speed. How much time, like what's the sense of urgency when you're talking in Manulife? There's a lot of, the company's doing well, but you're changing it, or the organization. What's your sense of time frame that's there?
It's a great question, and I personally feel very passionate about the fact that I think the biggest issue biggest mistake you could make is to think that you have time. I don't think we have time. Moore's law is certainly at work as it relates to data, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of the amount of data that's been collected in most recent years versus previous time. Data, quite frankly, is the new oil or gold of our generation. And the quicker you can embrace that idea, the better you're going to be able to adapt to what changes you need to apply to your business model to succeed in the future. I think with that backdrop, if you had this philosophy that you do have 2, 3, 5 years to get on the journey of transformation and really looking at how you're going to change the way you operate, I think you potentially will lose the game. So I think urgency is absolutely critical, and I think it has to be we must do it now mindset,
Right.
Otherwise, I think you stand to lose.
And how do you do that in the organization? Again, with an organization that's doing well, what are some tricks, or you know what I mean, or nudges, or things that you do to? Is it about decision speed? Is it reallocating resource? I'd just be interested in.
So you're right. Inertia is the biggest challenge that we have, and inertia is tougher when you're doing well. When you're not doing well, if you have a burning platform, if things are falling apart, it's much easier to galvanize a rallying cry around doing things differently. But if you've actually had a successful business that's operated very well, the inertia of doing things the way they have been done is kind of easy. So for us, we're really trying to ignite a fire and to agitate our people to this change agenda. I think it involves several ingredients. I think it starts with your why, and for us, this mission of making decisions easier and lives better is our rallying cry. And I don't think you can get people to rally to a cause if it's just that we want to deliver more profit, for example. But if it's about a greater purpose, a why, I think it's easier to rally people. And then as we think about our strategy and how we're executing that in our company, we then round out the pyramid, so to speak. If the why is at the top, the second element of our pyramid is the what. So what are we focused on and what are we going to be doing differently? And here we have a lot of initiatives that are going to the heart of what you've just described, and that is, digitizing our operations and making sure that we look at every interaction and ask ourselves, is it gold standard? Or is it bronze? And if it's bronze, how do we get it to gold?
Right. And everyone's involved.
And we have a huge body of work that's really focused on that. The final ingredient of our strategy and our pyramid is the how. And here is where we rely on our values and making sure that we really bring our values to the fore and that people behave the right way, not just do the right thing, but they do it in the right way. But urgency is certainly something that we're trying to drive, and I think it has to come from the top. It's something that I have to bring to every meeting that I attend, and my team has to demonstrate that same level of anxiety and that urgency and that passion. And if you don't have that, it's very hard to get someone that's maybe 12, 13 layers beneath you in the organization to be passionate about the change.
Excellent. Well, just related to that technology change, and the 35,000 employees and so forth, is there you're totally embracing technology, and I know that you're doing a lot in AI and other places. How does the organization feel on the skills side? Are people having to reskill? Are you having to hire different people? Just give us a sense of that. We had this recent AI conference in Shanghai, I think, where you had, I think, Elon Musk with Jack Ma talking about AI, and Elon Musk has a dark view that AI is going to, I think the quote is, we're going to be the bootloader. Humanity will be the bootloader for the more significant intelligence that's out there. Basically, a bootloader is not a very nice term if you don't understand what it is. We sort of flick the switch and everything happens. But there's a fear, I'm just trying, of technology and where it is. And so how are you dealing with that?
So I think technology is going to be much more important in the new economy and, quite frankly, in the future of our organization and, quite frankly, our industry and many other industries. As we've seen, technology is a huge enabler of creating much better, much more intuitive, simple and easier solutions for a customer. I think there is a danger that often gets overplayed, though. I do think that there is always going to be a critical need for humans in the process. There is empathy, there's human touch. There's a desire to actually connect with consumers and to show that you care and that you're looking for creative solutions that aren't necessarily out of the box or where A plus B equals C. So I think, really dialing up the human touch is critical. But using technology to do away with the valueless elements of the process, those parts of the process that don't create value for the consumer and, quite frankly, just add cost, is where I think the biggest battle should be fought. And for us, again, we're really having to invest a lot in technology. We spend actually quite a lot of money on technology every year, and we're going to keep doubling up on that. And it is a balance of bringing new technology in, new people in, but also upskilling our existing people to that new demand. And we, I've seen other organizations that have simply partitioned the new from the old, and I think it's a recipe for failure. I think the surefire way to create antagonism between what you're doing today and the future is if you separate them in separate entities, because they're going to be fighting like crazy. and to bring the people that work for you on the journey and to help them understand how they are a really important part of the future is as important as it is to bringing new technology and skills and capabilities on board.
Excellent. I'm getting all sorts of signals and jumping up to close, but I just have one last question, which is around the video you showed at the beginning, of quite an emotional video, and seeing the connection that children have with their parents who are working in the company. And obviously the Business Roundtable in the US just put out this notion that, you know, the purpose of the corporation is not just about shareholder value, it's broader. A lot of people were excited, a lot of people said this is not really true, it's greenwashing, but it feels like that's something you are trying to drive into the organization. How are you ensuring that this is not just a slogan, which it doesn't seem to be at all, but how are you ensuring that that's the case and delivering? How do you deal with that?
Yeah, so Dominic, I think you're absolutely right. I think organizations that are going to be successful in the future will not be able to focus on just one stakeholder, and that is the shareholder. I think you need to balance out your delivery against your three key stakeholders. And organizations have shareholders, they also have customers, and they have employees. And if you're not taking care of all three equally, I think you have a recipe for failure. And I think you can survive in the short term if you just focused on one at the expense of the other two. But I think long-term sustainable success is only going to be possible if you focus on each of these three stakeholders equally. And I do think the common ingredient that binds and bonds those three stakeholders is purpose. And I agree with you completely. I think it is critical that you have a purpose statement that is inspiring, but it's also going to be genuine. If you came out and, you know, if I came out and said we're going to cure cancer as our purpose statement, it wouldn't be credible, and it's not something that I could really get many people in my organization to rally around. But having something that's credible, having something that you can get emotional about, I think is really important. But to your second point, it's not just simply enough to have it and put it on the wall, as I mentioned earlier. You have to make sure that this is a living, breathing part of how you operate each and every day. And I think that the company will test you on that. And I think it's critical that leaders are able to demonstrate how serious and how authentic they are against that mission statement. If at the very first challenge that the company's facing, you flip to, well, we'll just care about the shareholder and we don't care about purpose, then your staff are going to sort of look very cynically at you, and they're going to say, well, okay, we really understand what the purpose is and how important it is. So I personally take this view that I'm being judged every day on my actions. I need to lead by example. I need to hold my leadership team accountable to their actions, and we will be judged not just by the analyst community or the shareholders, but we will be judged by our employees and clearly ultimately by our customers. And I think that bar of accountability is critical and, quite frankly, very healthy.
And it seems to be a source of energy in the organization.
Agree,
So,
yeah.
Well, good. I'm getting all sorts of signals we have to close off. But so I want to finish by thanking you, Roy, for really a masterclass that you gave us on transformation. It's the epitome of many of the changes that are underway in the world, and for spending the time with us and the dialogue. So thank you very much, Roy.
Thank you. Thank you, and congratulations.
Thank you.